If you grew up anywhere near a British farm, you knew the name International Harvester the way you knew the weather. It was on the tractor in every farmyard, at every county show, across every autumn field. At its peak, the Doncaster factory employed 2,000 workers and built more than 400,000 tractors from Sheffield steel. They survived a strike that should have destroyed the parent company, survived 3 changes of ownership across 2 continents, and in 2006, they won European Tractor of the Year. Then, after 58 years of making, the factory went silent. How does a workforce that just won Europe's Machine of the Year lose the factory they built it in? What happened on Wheatley Hall Road? Chapter 1. The Reaper and the River Don. The story begins with a blade. In 1831, in a Virginia wheat field, a young man named Cyrus Hall McCormick demonstrated a mechanical reaper that could cut grain faster than a dozen men swinging scythes. He was 22. His father had tried to build the same machine and failed. The son succeeded, and in doing so, set in motion a chain of invention, ambition, and industrial expansion that would, more than a century later, place a tractor factory on the banks of the River Don in South Yorkshire. McCormick patented his reaper in 1834. He moved his works to Chicago in 1847, closer to the prairie farms that needed his machine most. By the 1890s, the McCormick Harvesting Machine Company's Southside Chicago factory covered more than 1 million square feet and employed over 5,000 men. It was already one of America's great industrial enterprises. But McCormick wanted more than dominance. He wanted monopoly. In 1902, the financier J.P. Morgan engineered what the American press called the Harvester Trust, a merger of McCormick's firm with the Deering Harvester Company and 3 smaller rivals, Milwaukee Harvester, Plano Manufacturing, and Warder, Bushnell and Glessner. The combined entity was named International Harvester Company. It controlled roughly 80% of the American harvester market overnight. Cyrus McCormick's son, Cyrus Jr., became the first president. The reaper that began in a Virginia field now sat at the heart of the largest agricultural equipment manufacturer on Earth. International Harvester's ambitions didn't stop at the American coastline. The company had exhibited at London's Great Exhibition in 1851, where the original McCormick Reaper won the Council Medal. Britain was a market IH intended to own. On 31 December 1906, International Harvester of Great Britain Ltd was incorporated in London, with offices at 115 Southwark Street. For 3 decades, IHGB imported American-made product, opening a Liverpool assembly facility at Orrell Park in 1923 to bolt together machines shipped across the Atlantic. But assembly wasn't manufacturing, and by the mid-1930s, IH's Chicago executives, encouraged by the imperial preference tariff framework that made British-built goods cheaper across the empire, judged that Britain needed a proper production base. Not an assembly shed in Liverpool, a factory that could pour its own castings, machine its own components, build its own tractors from raw steel to finished machine. They chose Doncaster. The town in 1936 was a railway and mining settlement of roughly 85,000 people. Its identity had been forged by 2 industries, coal and locomotives. The collieries ringed it: Brodsworth, Bullcroft, Hatfield, Markham, Maine, Cadeby, Dennerby, Yorkshiremen, and the Great Northern Railway's locomotive works, known simply as the plant, had been the town's central employer since 1853. It was at the plant that Chief Mechanical Engineer Sir Nigel Gresley's team had built the Flying Scotsman in 1923 and would build Mallard in 1938, the locomotive that still holds the world speed record for steam at 126 miles per hour. By 1913, the plant employed 4,600 men across 200 acres of workshops, foundries, and erecting halls. Doncaster knew how to work metal. It knew heavy engineering the way a port town knows the sea. What Doncaster lacked was diversification. Coal and railways were cyclical, vulnerable, politically exposed. The corporation, the local authority, was actively seeking new industry. International Harvester offered exactly what the town needed: a large, stable employer in a growing sector that had nothing to do with coal seams or railway orders. The site IH purchased in 1936 sat at Wheatley Hall, on Doncaster's northeastern flank. It offered 4 advantages that Chicago's planners valued. First, direct access to the East Coast Main Line for rail freight. Second, the River Don for heavy transport. Third, proximity to England's largest arable region, Lincolnshire, the East Riding, the Vale of York, meaning the tractors would be built within haulage distance of the farms that would buy them. And fourth, that deep pool of skilled labour drawn from the plant and the pits. Men who understood foundry work, who could read engineering drawings, who arrived on time for a shift because they'd grown up in households where the works hooter ruled the day. IH built a large factory on the Wheatley Hall site in 1938. The intention was agricultural implement production, ploughs, cultivators, the heavy iron that British farms needed as mechanisation accelerated. But the timing was brutal. War broke out before the first tractor could be built. The Ministry of Supply requisitioned the brand new factory. From 1939 to 1946, Wheatley Hall produced not tractors, but .303 rifle ammunition, millions of rounds, feeding the Lee-Enfield rifles carried by British soldiers from North Africa to Normandy. The buildings erected by an American agricultural company became, for 7 years, part of Britain's war machine. Archaeological surveys conducted during the site's eventual demolition in the 2010s noted that the wartime structures were of types now extremely rare anywhere in Britain, a small accidental piece of military heritage wrapped inside an agricultural story. IH took back possession in 1946. The factory reopened as a service parts and implement works. A new foundry was added to pour heavy castings. And then, on 13th of September 1949, the first tractor rolled off the Doncaster line. It was a Farmall M, assembled initially from American-shipped components, painted the distinctive International Harvester red, and driven off the line into the Yorkshire Light. The first customer was Alan Neal, son of IHGB chairman Arthur Neal. Alan farmed 1,200 acres near Cambridge. He took delivery of that very first Doncaster Farmall M, put it to work on his land, and, according to Lee Clanch's history, Red Tractors 1958, 2013, the tractor remains in the Neal family to this day, 3/4 of a century on. 2 years later, on 30th of June 1951, the first fully British-built tractor came off the line. Every component sourced and manufactured in the United Kingdom. Nothing shipped from Chicago. In 1952, the first British-built diesel, the Farmall BMD, followed. Doncaster was no longer assembling American machines. It was building British tractors. The works hooter now sounded for a new purpose, and for the next 58 years, it wouldn't stop. Chapter 2. Red Machines. Across the Wolds, the Farmall BMD was Doncaster's first serious statement of intent. It ran a long-stroke diesel engine from the BD281 family, a 4-cylinder unit that Yorkshire farmers came to trust the way they trusted the weather forecast. Not always elegant, but reliable when it mattered. Around 8,000 BMDs were built across 1954 to 1958, and the tractor established a reputation that would define the Doncaster product for decades. Sturdy, honest, built to work a Lincolnshire clay field in February and not complain about it. Alongside the BMD, the factory produced the Super BM in petrol and TVO variants, fewer than 2,000 built, making survivors among the rarest British international harvesters today. The BWD6 diesel served the European row crop market. Each model pushed Doncaster's capability further from assembly towards genuine design and build manufacturing. Then came the machine that changed the factory's standing. In 1957, IH launched the B450, a 55-horsepower 4-cylinder indirect injection diesel with a 5-speed gearbox, differential lock and disc brakes. Listed in 1959 at £795, plus £90 for the PTO and hydraulic linkage, the B450 sat in the mid-range market where British mixed farms lived. It wasn't the cheapest tractor in the field. The Fordson Dexter and the Massey Ferguson 35 had that ground covered. But the B450 offered something its competitors didn't, a combination of hydraulic sophistication and build quality that made it the tractor serious arable farmers chose when they could afford the difference. It stayed in production until 1970, 13 years on the line, a remarkable run that testified to how right Doncaster's engineers had got it. By now, IH wasn't operating from Wheatley Hall Road alone. In 1954, the company had acquired the former Jowett car factory at Bradford, the works where Jowett had built the Jupiter and Javelin before going under, and converted it to produce the smaller B250 tractor. Bradford gave IH a second Yorkshire production line and a direct competitor to the Fordson at the lighter end of the market. In 1964, Doncaster opened a second site 3 miles from Wheatley Hall Road, the Carhill Works, adding another 30-odd acres of production space. The same year, the B6YT ushered in the modern 8-speed transmission era at Doncaster, and a new generation of mid-range tractors began flowing off both lines. Something else was happening too. From 1959, Doncaster's smaller tractors began travelling back across the Atlantic, exported to North America as chore tractors for American farms that needed a compact, reliable machine for light duties. A British-built international harvester, designed and assembled by Yorkshire workers, being loaded onto ships bound for the country where the company had been born. The student had become the teacher. British tractor manufacturing in the late 1960s was a 5-cornered fight, and every corner had a factory town staked on it. Massey Ferguson built at Banner Lane, Coventry, the volume champion, the Ford of tractors, the name every farmer knew first. Ford itself built at Basildon, Essex, the Fordson lineage, the 5000 and 7000 series, the dealer network that reached every market town in England. David Brown built at Meltham, near Huddersfield, smaller, independent, a Yorkshire rival on IH's own doorstep. British Leyland's Nuffield Tractor Division operated from Bathgate, Scotland. An international harvester held its ground from Doncaster, Bradford, Carhill and Liverpool. What set Doncaster apart was its bet on the mid-range European tractor with modern hydraulics and, from 1970, the worldwide range. The 454, the 574, the 674, these were the first European tractors to offer synchronized transmissions as standard, with optional hydrostatic drive. The 574, built at Doncaster from 1970 to 1978, came with either a 3.3-litre 4-cylinder petrol or a 3.9-litre 4-cylinder diesel and up to 3 transmission options, the most sophisticated being a 16-speed power shift. For a mixed farm in the East Riding or a dairy operation in the Dales, the 574 was the machine that did everything you asked of it, in every season, without drama. And then, in 1981, Doncaster played its trump card. The 85 and 95 series arrived with a cab designed by Porsche. Yes, the same Porsche. The XL cab was a revelation. Previous tractor cabs had been afterthoughts. Metal boxes bolted onto machines designed to be driven in the open air. The XL was engineered from the ground up for visibility, noise reduction, and operator comfort. The flagship 8/5XL became the tractor that defined Doncaster in the minds of a generation of British farmers. You could spend 12 hours in that cab during harvest and climb down at dusk without your back in ruins and your ears ringing. In a trade where the machine was your office, your workshop, and your daily companion from dawn to dark, that mattered enormously. Doncaster had one more audacious move in the early 1980s. The 2+2 articulated tractors, nicknamed Snoopy for their distinctively long bonnets, were an attempt to compete in the high horsepower bracket against the big American and Canadian 4-wheel drives. They were brave, unusual, and commercially patchy. Farmers admired the engineering. Not enough of them bought the machine. But the 2+2 showed what Doncaster was willing to try. This was a factory that didn't just build to a brief. It reached. By the mid-1970s, International Harvester held more than 10% of the entire UK market for tractors and combine harvesters. The British tractor industry as a whole produced 185,000 machines in 1975, and across Wheatley Hall Road and Carhill, roughly 2,000 men and women clocked in every morning to build them. Chapter 3. The smell of hot metal and diesel. Imagine arriving at the Wheatley Hall Road gates on a Monday morning in 1974. The walk from the terraced streets of Wheatley and Intake took 10 minutes, maybe 15. You'd hear the works before you saw it. A low, continuous vibration that came up through the pavement, the sound of heavy machinery already running on the night shift, the foundry never quite cooling. Through the gates, the scale hit you. 112 acres of factory, storage yards, offices and foundry halls, stretching back from Wheatley Hall Road towards the River Don. The assembly hall alone could swallow a football pitch. And the smell, hot metal from the foundry, diesel fuel from the test bays, the sharp chemical bite of fresh paint from the finishing line, and underneath it all, the mineral tang of machining oil, the lubricant that got into everything. Your overalls, your hands, the sandwich you ate at your bench if you couldn't be bothered walking to the canteen. Raw steel arrived from Sheffield, 30 miles to the west, along the Don Valley corridor that connected South Yorkshire's two great industrial cities. The foundry poured and machined heavy castings on site, transmission housings, axle cases, the structural bones of a tractor. Engines came from two sources. In the IH era, smaller power plants were built at the Bradford Works. Larger diesels, the D-series units that powered the worldwide range from 1970 onwards, arrived from IH's factory at Neuss in West Germany. Later, under Case IH, transmissions were built at the Saint-Dizier Works in France. Doncaster sat at the centre of a European supply web, pulling components from Sheffield, Bradford, the Rhineland and the Champagne country, and turning them into finished machines. The assembly process was track-built. A bare chassis entered at one end of the assembly hall. As it moved along the line, each station added the next layer: engine, transmission, axles, hydraulics, cab, electrics, paint. At each station, a man or a small team had their operation, their tools, their rhythm. The newer hands learned from the experienced ones. A fitter who'd been on the transmission station for 15 years could feel whether a gear train was seated properly by touch alone, the slight resistance that told you everything was meshed, or the fractional looseness that meant stripping it back and starting again. By the end of the line, a completed tractor rolled into the test bay. Every machine was water-tested, sealed and subjected to simulated rainfall to prove the cab and electrics against Yorkshire weather. Every machine was run through its gears, its hydraulics cycled, its engine loaded. Nothing left the factory until it passed. In McCormick's final years, the line was producing one finished tractor every 25 to 30 minutes, a pace that sounds leisurely until you consider that each machine weighed several tons and contained thousands of individual components, every one of which had to be right. A tractor isn't a consumer gadget that can be recalled with a software patch. It's a working machine that will spend 20 years in a field, in all weather, doing the heaviest work on a farm. The margin for error was measured in lives. At the end of the process, the finished machines were driven out of the assembly hall and into the enormous storage yard that stretched towards the river. Row upon row of new red tractors, lined up in the Yorkshire light, waiting for transport to dealers across Britain, across Europe, across the world. A 1966 press photograph, taken by Michael Walters for Paul Walters Worldwide Photography, now held by Heritage Images, captures the image at its most striking. Hundreds of red machines in perfect formation, the assembly hall behind them, the pale winter sky above. It looked like an army mustering. In a way, it was. These machines would plough the fields that fed the country. Chapter 4. Fathers and Sons on Wheatley Hall Road. The workforce at Wheatley Hall Road was drawn almost entirely from the streets that surrounded it. Northeast Doncaster, Wheatley, Wheatley Hills, Intake, Bentley, Arksey, Long Sandal, Clay Lane. These were the wards that fed the factory, and the factory fed them. Further out, the Don Valley colliery villages sent men too, especially as the pits began their long contraction. A miner's son who couldn't follow his father underground might follow a neighbour's father through the tractor works gates instead. Multi-generational employment was the norm, not the exception. The International Harvesters Club of Great Britain, still active today at ihgb.org, notes that its membership includes many former IHGB employees and ex-IH dealer staff. Conversations on the club's forums carry the particular affection of people who didn't just work at a place but belonged to it. Fathers brought sons, uncles brought nephews. The factory was a family enterprise in the truest sense, not because the family owned it, but because entire families worked there. The trade unions structured the shop floor. The Amalgamated Engineering Union, the AEU, later the AEU, then Amicus, and finally absorbed into Unite in May 2007, represented the skilled engineering trades, the fitters, the turners, the tool makers, the electricians. The Transport and General Workers Union, the TGWU, later the T&G, then also into Unite, covered the semi-skilled and process workers on the assembly line. The two unions between them gave the workforce a collective voice, negotiated pay and conditions, and, when it mattered most, at the very end, handled the consultation that accompanied the closure. Beyond the shop floor, the IH Works generated the social infrastructure that made it more than a place of employment. The IHGB Sports and Social Club gave workers and their families a place to drink, to play darts, to organise the annual outing. The works canteen, serving breakfasts to the early shift, dinners to the day shift and tea to the latecomers, was where gossip circulated, where union reps tested opinion, where new starters learned who to listen to and who to avoid. The surrounding pubs on Beckett Road and Thorne Road filled at shift changeovers. Friday afternoon, wage packets in pockets, the factory spilled into the neighbourhood in a way that made the boundary between work and life almost invisible. Women's roles at Doncaster are poorly documented in the public record, a gap that the Mike Teenby book and Doncaster archives might one day help to fill. Parallel evidence from the Elna Works, which hired large numbers of women during the Second World War and retained many in post-war roles, and from IH's American factories, where female welders were documented during wartime production, suggests that women were employed at Wheatley Hall from the 1950s onwards, in office, canteen, paint and trim, and parts and stores roles, and from the 1980s in test and inspection positions. They were part of the fabric. The record just hasn't caught up with them yet. For the children who grew up in the streets backing onto Wheatley Hall Road, the tractor factory was as permanent a feature of their landscape as the school, the chip shop, or the coal-fired power station on the horizon. The sound carried. The vibration carried. The knowledge that your dad, your uncle, your granddad was in there, building something real, something you could see on every farm in the county, carried furthest of all. Doncaster in the 1970s was a four-handed industrial town. Rail, coal, chemicals, tractors. The plants still built and repaired rolling stock. The collieries still sent coal to the surface. The ICI DuPont nylon works on Wheatley Hall Road itself, right next door to the tractor factory, employed hundreds more in chemical production. And International Harvester, with 2,000 workers across Wheatley Hall and Car Hill, built the machines that turned the soil of eastern England. It was a balanced ecology. Each industry supported the others through supply chains, shared labour markets, and the simple commercial gravity of wages being spent in the same streets. The pubs served all of them. The shops served all of them. The council served all of them. Remove one, and the ecology could adapt. Remove two, and it would strain. Remove all four, which is what the next 3 decades would do, and the ecology would collapse. But in 1975, with 185,000 tractors rolling off British assembly lines every year and IH holding more than 1/10 of the market, collapse was unthinkable. The gates opened. The hooter sounded. The red machines kept coming. Chapter 5. The Summit and the Shadow. The peak was not a single day. It was a plateau, roughly 1970 to 1979, during which International Harvester at Doncaster operated at something close to its full capacity, across 2 sites, 4 product ranges, and a market that seemed, if not limitless, then at least durably large. The worldwide range was at full flow. The 574 and its siblings were selling across Britain and into export markets from Scandinavia to Australasia. The Bradford Works was still running. Car Hill was humming. The Liverpool facility, the original 1923 assembly operation, was still part of the network. 2,000 people, 4 British works, more than 10% of the national market. The 1975 figure, 185,000 tractors built across the entire British industry, deserves context. Britain in 1975 was the world's second largest tractor exporter after the United States. Ford at Basildon, Massey Ferguson at Banner Lane, David Brown at Meltham, British Leyland at Bathgate, International Harvester at Doncaster. Between them, these factories supplied not just British farms, but a significant share of global demand. A British-built tractor was as much an export product as a Rolls-Royce jet engine or a Scotch whisky. At Doncaster, the Porsche-designed XL cab was about to arrive. The 885 XL was 2 years from launch, and when it came in 1981, it would give the factory its most iconic product since the Farmall M. And in 2004, a quarter century in the future, under a name and an ownership that no one in 1979 could have predicted, a tractor built at Wheatley Hall Road would win the European Tractor of the Year award. The best was, in a sense, still to come. But 1979 was the summit, the highest point before the fall. And standing there, on the broad plateau of a 10% market share, with red machines lined up in the yard and the foundry pouring steel. Nobody inside those walls could see the cliff they were about to walk off, because the cliff wasn't in Doncaster, it was in Chicago, and it had a name: Archie McArdle. Chapter 6. The Strike That Broke the Machine. Archie McArdle arrived at International Harvester's Chicago headquarters in 1977. Like a surgeon arriving at a hospital, he intended to reorganize before he'd examined the patients. He'd been recruited from Xerox, where he'd built a reputation as a cost-cutter of fearsome efficiency. IH's board agreed to pay him a salary of $460,000, a signing bonus of $1.5 million, and a personal loan of $1.8 million at 6% interest. In today's terms, that package would be remarkable. In 1977, it was extraordinary, and it told you everything about what McArdle believed he was worth and what IH's board believed they were buying. What they were buying was confrontation. McArdle looked at IH's labor costs and saw fat to be trimmed. He targeted overtime rules, work practices, and the accumulated negotiating gains of 30 years of United Auto Workers contracts. The UAW looked at McArdle and saw an outsider who understood spreadsheets but not shop floors, who knew how to cut costs but not how to build a tractor. On 1st November 1979, the day after IH publicly announced McArdle's $1.8 million bonus, 35,000 UAW members at 21 IH plants in 8 American states walked off the job. The timing was not coincidental. The bonus was the match. The dry tinder had been accumulating for months. The strike lasted 172 days. It was the 4th longest UAW strike in history. During the stoppage, IH lost $479.4 million. In the fiscal year that followed, the company lost another $397.3 million. Combined, that was nearly $900 million, a wound from which International Harvester would never recover. The consequences cascaded outward from Chicago like shockwaves. By 1981, IH was in restructuring talks with 200 creditor banks holding $4.5 billion of debt. McArdle was forced out in May 1982, and across the Atlantic, the first British casualty fell. The Bradford Works, the converted Jowett car factory that had built the B-250, closed in 1982. Car Hill was mothballed in 1983. Liverpool would wind down. Of the 4 British works that had operated at the peak, only Wheatley Hall Road survived. The men and women who walked through those Doncaster gates every morning had done nothing wrong. They hadn't struck. They hadn't demanded unsustainable wages. They hadn't built a bad product. But the company whose name was above their door was bleeding to death from a self-inflicted wound administered in a Chicago boardroom by a man who'd never set foot on the Wheatley Hall Road shop floor. The Bradford workers lost their jobs because an American CEO had decided to pick a fight with an American union over American overtime rules, and the financial devastation that followed required the amputation of the limbs furthest from the heart. Doncaster survived, but it survived diminished, isolated, the last British outpost of an American empire that was falling apart. On 26th of November 1984, Tenneco, the Houston-based oil and gas conglomerate that already owned J.I. Case, bought International Harvester's entire agricultural equipment division. The price was $430 million in cash and stock. For context, IH had lost nearly $900 million in the strike and its aftermath alone. The agricultural division, the tractors, the combines, the implements, the factories, the brand, the heritage stretching back to Cyrus McCormick's Virginia Reaper, was sold for less than half what the strike had cost. The new entity was branded Case IH from 1985. The International Harvester name and trademark stayed with the truck and engine residual, which renamed itself Navistar International in 1986. The red livery remained, but the badge changed. For the workers at Wheatley Hall Road, the shift was felt more in the letterhead than the daily routine. The same foundry, the same assembly line, the same tractors coming off the end. But the decisions were now made in Houston, not Chicago. And the corporate logic had changed. IH had been an agricultural company that happened to make other things. Tenneco was an oil and gas conglomerate that happened to own a tractor brand. The difference would prove fatal. Through the late 1980s and 1990s, Doncaster built for Case IH, the 4200 series, the 5100 Maxim, the MX Maxim, and the plant ran competently profitably and without drama. The David Brown Works at Meltham, near Huddersfield, closed in 1988. British Leyland's Bathgate tractor operation had already gone in 1986. Massey Ferguson at Banner Lane in Coventry was shrinking. One by one, the five corners of British tractor manufacturing were being dismantled. By 1990, only three remained standing: Ford at Basildon, Massey at Coventry, and Case IH at Doncaster. The British industry that had built 185,000 tractors in 1975 was producing fewer than 14,000 a year by the mid-2000s. The market hadn't just contracted, it had collapsed, hollowed out by the strong pound, the McSharry cap reforms of 1992, the BSE crisis of 1996, and the relentless consolidation of British farms into larger, fewer units that bought bigger machines less often. Every factor that had made Doncaster viable in 1970, the deep domestic market, the accessible export routes, the competitive labour costs, was eroding year by year, the ground softening beneath the factory's foundations while the assembly line above kept running. Chapter 7. The Brussels Reprieve. On 17th of May 1999, in a deal negotiated across boardrooms in Turin, Racine and Amsterdam, New Holland NV agreed to acquire Case Corporation for $4.6 billion. New Holland was controlled 71% by Fiat Group. Case was the descendant of Tenneco's agricultural acquisition, the entity that had absorbed International Harvester's farm equipment division 15 years earlier. The combined company would be called CNH Global NV, incorporated in the Netherlands, headquartered in Racine, Wisconsin, and listed on the New York Stock Exchange. Jean-Pierre Rousseau, former Case chairman, and Umberto Quadrino, former New Holland CEO, became co-chairman. Paolo Monferino was named president and CEO in 2000. The ultimate decision-maker on the European side was Fiat's chairman, Paolo Cantarella. For the workers at Wheatley Hall Road, the merger was a death sentence dressed in corporate language. CNH would now own both the Case IH factory at Doncaster and the New Holland factory at Basildon. Two tractor plants, one country, one merged corporation. No business in history has completed a mega-merger and kept both factories running when one could do the work of two, except that someone in Brussels disagreed. The European Commission's Directorate General for Competition opened proceedings under case COMP M 1571, New Holland Case. The Commission's analysts calculated the combined CNH market shares across Europe and found numbers that would make any competition regulator reach for the red pen. In the United Kingdom, 40 to 45%, more than twice the next competitor. In Belgium and Luxembourg, 40 to 45%. In Austria, 45 to 50%. In Denmark, 45 to 55%. In Iceland, 50 to 55%. On 28th October 1999, the Commission cleared the merger, but only on condition of substantial divestitures. CNH was ordered to sell Case's Doncaster tractor business, including the freehold, the C, CX and MXC tractor ranges, and the engineering capability. It was also forced to divest Case's Manchester-based Firmec backhoe operations, the Neustadt large square baler business in Germany, New Holland's Lavada combine business, and the versatile four-wheel drive plant in Winnipeg, which was sold to Böhler Industries. The Brussels decision was, in effect, a stay of execution. Without it, Doncaster would almost certainly have been absorbed into CNH's rationalised European network, production consolidated at Basildon and the Steyr plant at St. Valentin in Austria, the Wheatley Hall Road site closed, the workforce dispersed. The European Commission's competition regulators, sitting in offices on Rue de la Loi, had extended the life of a Yorkshire tractor factory by, as it would turn out, precisely 7 years. The question was, who would buy it? The answer arrived from Italy. Argo Spie, an agricultural equipment group based at Fabrico, near Reggio Emilia, parent of the Landini tractor brand and the Lavada combine business, saw in Doncaster an opportunity to build a third global tractor brand. In January 2001, through a newly created vehicle called McCormick Tractors International Ltd, Argo purchased the Doncaster freehold, the rights to the Case, IHC, CX and MXC tractor ranges, a license to build the MX Maxim, and, crucially, the McCormick name. The name mattered. McCormick was the oldest name in mechanized agriculture, stretching back to Cyrus's Virginia Reaper of 1831. It carried recognition across every English-speaking farming market in the world. Argo was buying not just a factory, but a brand with 170 years of heritage. Roger Purdy was appointed managing director of the new McCormick operation at Doncaster. Mike Edmond ran sales and marketing. Mick Howitt managed the brand. Jeremy Lamb would become sales director. Argo retained 298 Doncaster design, engineering and manufacturing staff and added 52 non-manufacturing roles. From a standing start in January 2001, new name on the gate, new badge on the tractors, new corporate parent in Italy, the plant built 2,000 tractors by the end of its first year. By 2003, it was targeting 5,500 units annually. For a brief, exhilarating period, it looked like salvation. By 2004, McCormick had climbed to 4th place in the UK tractor market, 1,241 registrations, 8% market share, actually displacing Case IH itself, which recorded 1,217 units at 7.8%. The subsidiary had overtaken the parent's successor brand. The David who'd been sold off by Goliath was now outselling Goliath's own product on Goliath's former home turf. And then, in 2006, came the crowning achievement. The McCormick XTX series, designed and built entirely at Wheatley Hall Road, with transmissions from the Saint Dizier factory in France that Argo had acquired in June 2001, won the European Tractor of the Year award. The CX-105 Diamond Edition launched the same year, with the first delivery going to a Lincolnshire farmer contractor. Doncaster was building award-winning machines, gaining market share, and operating with the confidence of a business that had survived the worst and come through. The trophy was presented. The press releases were written. The workers on the line could take genuine pride in having built Europe's machine of the year. The trophy preceded the obituary by months. Chapter 8. The Christmas Announcement. In 2005, Argo had sold the Wheatley Hall Road freehold, reportedly for £16 million, and leased the site back on a 40-year lease. At the time, the transaction looked like prudent financial management, monetize the property asset, free up capital for investment in the product. In hindsight, it was preparation. A company that sells the building it works in and agrees to rent it back for 4 decades has made a calculation about what that building is worth to it. And if production volumes fall, the rent doesn't fall with them. The lease becomes a millstone. Through 2006, the pound sterling was climbing against the dollar. For McCormick, whose second largest market after Britain was the United States, every penny of appreciation against the dollar cut directly into export margins. American dealers buying Doncaster-built tractors were paying more for every machine in dollar terms. The pound would hit a 15-year high of $2 in April 2007, the first time since 1992, and go on to reach a 26-year peak of $2.11 on 7th of November 2007. But the damage to Argo's calculations was being done well before those headlines. Through 2005 and 2006, the currency trend was visible, persistent, and running the wrong way. European tractor demand was softening. The post-cap reform adjustment was still working through farm budgets, and Argo's largest factory, its own historic Landini works at Fabrico, near Reggio Emilia, had spare capacity. The Italian plant employed a larger workforce, operated in euros, served the continental market more directly, and carried lower per-unit costs than a British factory paying sterling wages and exporting at unfavourable exchange rates. The arithmetic was brutal, and it was simple. Argo owned 2 factories. One was in Italy, close to the parent, denominated in euros with spare capacity. The other was in Yorkshire, denominated in sterling, exporting into a falling dollar, on a leased site. The product was transferable. The tooling was movable. The workforce was not. On Monday, 18th of December 2006, 1 week before Christmas, Argo's senior management called the Doncaster workforce together and told them the plant would close. 325 production jobs. Gone. The BBC broke the story the following day. The announcement came during the parliamentary recess. The House wouldn't sit again until 8th of January 2007. Doncaster's 3 Labour MPs in 2006 were Rosie Winterton, Minister of State at the Department of Health, in whose constituency the plant sat, Caroline Flint, Minister for Public Health, representing Don Valley, and Ed Miliband, then a cabinet office minister representing Doncaster North. No publicly recorded statement on the closure has been recovered from any of them. The Doncaster mayor, Martin Winter, is likewise absent from the on-record response. Parliament was in recess. Christmas was coming, and a factory that had built tractors for 57 years was told it had 12 months to live. There was no large-scale protest, no march, no sit-in. Doncaster had already absorbed wave upon wave of closures through the 1990s. The collieries, the nylon works, the slow bleeding of the plant. The workforce, by 2006, was a fraction of its IH-era peak, 380 people, not 3,000, not 10,000. The scale of the loss was devastating to those who lived it, but it lacked the critical mass that would have turned it into a national campaign. The Doncaster Free Press covered it. The Yorkshire Post covered it. The Sheffield Star covered it. Farmers Weekly gave it proper agricultural industry treatment. But there was no Longbridge moment, no Rover-style televised vigil, no minister standing at the gates pledging a rescue. Unite the Union, which was itself in the process of being formed from the merger of Amicus and the T&G, completed on 1st May 2007, handled the consultation. Redundancy packages were negotiated under standard statutory plus enhanced terms. The union did what it could. The company did what it had decided. Sales Director Jeremy Lamb gave the corporate rationale to Farmers Weekly. Weakening European markets, a slump in American tractor sales, and a sterling-dollar exchange rate that made US imports more expensive had driven production volumes down to uneconomic levels. Sad as it is to see the Doncaster plant being closed, Lamb said, it makes economic sense to add McCormick production to the larger parent group factory in Italy. Economic sense, the two words that have closed more British factories than any act of God. There was one final flicker. The Russian truck maker Kamaz briefly negotiated to buy the tooling for the XTX series, which would have continued Doncaster-designed production in Russia. The deal didn't complete. The UK headquarters function relocated to a new purpose-built facility at Harworth, about 12 miles south, where Agriago UK still operates today, as a sales and parts company, not a manufacturer. Chapter 9. The 435,136th machine. The wind-down lasted a year. The December 2006 announcement had originally said production would end mid-2007, but some XTX and CX series tractors were still being built into late autumn. The line slowed. Orders thinned. The yard that had once held hundreds of red machines in formation held fewer each week. On 14th of December 2007, the last tractor built at Doncaster, an XTX 215B, was driven off the Wheatley Hall Road assembly line. It was the 435,836th machine, built at that factory since the first Farmel M had rolled off the same line on 13th of September 1949. 58 years and 3 months. 371 workers were made redundant. The line stopped. The machines fell silent. The foundry that had poured castings since 1946 cooled for the last time. Production transferred to Argo's Landini factory at Fabrico, near Reggio Emilia. Italian hands would now build what Yorkshire hands had built for nearly 6 decades. The familiar McCormick products, the CX, the MTX, the XTX ranges, remained in production. The tractors didn't disappear. The factory did. McCormick held a small closing ceremony. The final CX series tractor was auctioned to mark what the company called the plant's historic contribution to agriculture. A contribution measured in 435,000 machines, in fields ploughed across Lincolnshire and the East Riding, in harvests gathered from Cambridgeshire to Cumbria, in the working lives of thousands of Yorkshire men and women who had built something real with their hands, every day, for 2 generations. Chapter 10. Riverdale Park. The factory didn't die quickly. Death came in stages. The sales, marketing, service and parts operation wound down at Wheatley Hall Road through 2008 and 2009, transferred piece by piece to the new Harworth facility. The building stood empty. The gates were locked. The yard, where red tractors had once lined up in their hundreds, grew weeds through the tarmac. Of the 371 final staff, some found work at Agriago's Harworth base. Others scattered across the surviving engineering employers in the area. Cooper Lighting on Wheatley Hall Road, the JCB plants at Rochester and Cheadle, Wobtec at the plant. A proportion left engineering altogether for the warehouse and logistics economy growing up around Doncaster's M18 corridor and the international railport. The skills that had built award-winning tractors, the fitting, the machining, the eye for tolerance and finish, were redeployed into packing and dispatching, or they weren't redeployed at all. The site itself fell into receivership. In December 2015, Harworth Estates, the property group that had been spun out of the old UK Coal Company, acquired the 112-acre site for £8.5 million. £8.5 million for 112 acres that had once employed 2,000 people and built 435,000 tractors. The maths of industrial decline reduced to a price per acre. All buildings on the site were demolished by 2018. JRP Associates of Sheffield drew up a master plan. The site was renamed Riverdale Park. Outline planning consent was granted for 600 new homes, 191 to Barratt Homes, 188 to Taylor Wimpey, the balance to other house builders, plus 200,000 square feet of commercial and retail space along the River Don frontage, with completion targeted for 2026. Where the foundry stood, there are 3-bedroom semis with allocated parking. Where the assembly hall ran 112 acres from gate to river, children cycle past cul-de-sacs, named after nothing in particular. The River Don still flows. The East Coast Main Line still runs. But the tractor factory, the 112-acre heart of the thing, is gone as completely as if it had never existed. A small memorial plaque stands tucked into a corner of the Wheatley shopping centre, immediately across Wheatley Hall Road from where the factory gates used to be. It reads, 50 Years International Harvester. It is the principal piece of heritage acknowledgement on the site. You could walk past it 100 times and never see it. When the McCormick plant closed in December 2007, Doncaster Archives received a donation of building drawings from 1946 to the 1980s, and personnel records recovered during the 2010s archaeological survey of the site. The Museum of English Rural Life at the University of Reading holds the wider IHGB corporate records. Catalogue references, TR-IHC and TR2-IHC, including Managing Director W. W. Johnson's files, internal personnel papers, product development records, and the IH House journal, The Harvester World. Mike Teenby, who worked at IHGB Doncaster from 1965 and later at IH's headquarters at Hinsdale in the United States, published The Roar of Dust and Diesel in 2004, the standard history of the plant. These fragments are what remain of an enterprise that lasted 69 years on one site. The wider Doncaster industrial picture completes the frame. The collieries closed across 1985 to 1994. The ICI DuPont Nylon Works on Wheatley Hall Road closed in 1999 and was demolished. The tractor factory closed in 2007. And Wobtec, the successor to the Great Northern Railway's plant works, where the Flying Scotsman and Mallard were built, announced in February 2025 that it would close with 300 jobs at risk, ending more than 170 years of railway engineering in Doncaster. Doncaster Sheffield Airport closed in 2022, with 800 direct and 2,700 supply chain jobs gone. The four-handed industrial town of 1970, rail, coal, chemicals, tractors, has lost all four hands. Chapter 11. What the Silence Holds. There is no mass tractor manufacturing left in Yorkshire. There is almost no mass tractor manufacturing left in Britain. CNH's New Holland plant at Basildon, the former Ford Tractor Works, inherited through the 1991 acquisition of Ford New Holland, still builds tractors in the T6, T7 and T8 ranges. JCB's Cheadle plant builds the Fast Track. JCB Rochester makes Loadall telehandlers. Beyond these, the industry that produced 185,000 machines a year in 1975, that employed tens of thousands from Coventry to Bathgate to Meltham to Doncaster, is finished. Massey Ferguson closed Banner Lane in 2003 after more than 3.3 million tractors. David Brown closed Meltham in 1988. British Leyland closed Bathgate in 1986. Marshall closed Gainsborough in the 1980s. And International Harvester, then Case IH, then McCormick, closed Doncaster on 14th December 2007. The tractors, though, are still out there. A Doncaster-built 574, its red paint faded to a dusty pink by 40 Yorkshire winters, still pulling a muck spreader across a Rydale farm. A B450, its £795 price tag a half-century memory, still turning over on the first pull in a Lincolnshire barn, an 885 XL with the Porsche cab, still putting in 12-hour days on a Cambridgeshire estate at harvest, and somewhere near Cambridge, on the farm that Alan Neil's family has worked since the 1940s, the very first Farmall M, serial number 1, 13 September 1949, still exists. 3/4 of a century of South Yorkshire engineering, built into a machine that was made to last and has. 435,836 tractors were built at Wheatley Hall Road between 1949 and 2007. They are scattered now across farmyards in Lincolnshire, Cambridgeshire, Norfolk, the Dales, the Welsh borders, France, Australia, Iowa, every corner of the farming world that once looked to Doncaster for its machines. Each one carries a small piece of the men and women who built it, the fitter who set the transmission, the painter who laid the red, the inspector who signed it off, the driver who took it to the yard. The factory is gone. The workforce has dispersed. The site is a housing estate with a shopping centre plaque that most people walk past without reading. But the machines endure, built by Yorkshire hands from Sheffield steel on the banks of the River Don. They endure. And in every field where a Doncaster tractor still turns the soil, the work goes on, long after the workers have gone home for the last time.